This is Death, Lies, and Alibis. Hello, I'm your host, Christy. Out here in rural Ohio, the nights are quiet, but not always peaceful. Every silence has a name, and every shadow has a story. And every cold case carries a weight you can feel if you stand still long enough. Today, we step into another one of those stories, forgotten by some and never forgotten by others. So, let's go together to where the questions are still hiding.
Intro.
Inside a maximum security prison built for control, something snaps. And by the time it's over, 10 people are dead. Some died during the violence of the uprising inside L Block after being accused of being informants or also snitches. Outside the prison walls, technical units begin surrounding the facility. Negotiators scramble. Media pours into rural Scioto County. And inside L Block, inmates organize fast. Leadership forms and demands are written. Rules are put in place. Now, this isn't random chaos. This is controlled chaos. And that's the part of what makes Lucasville so disturbing. Because the spark, well, at least officially, was a dispute over mandatory tuberculosis testing. Muslim inmates objected to the TB test because they believed the injection could violate their religious beliefs. Now, prison officials refused to make any exceptions. But if you think this riot was only about medical tests, you're missing the bigger story. Overcrowding, racial gang divisions, allegations of brutality and a culture of silence, and a prison system pushed hard by politics of the 1990s tough on crime. Now, the riot ends on April 21st, 1993, but the story doesn't end there. It moves into the courtrooms and into appeals, and to years of arguments over who led, who killed, who lied, and who paid for it. So tonight we're stepping inside Lucasville, not just the violence and not just the headlines, but for the pressure that built inside those walls, the decisions made during the uprisings, the deaths, the trials, and the controversy that still refuses to die. Because when a prison riot lasts 11 days, the story doesn't end when the gates close. It echoes. And in Ohio, it still echoes. Now, next, we go back to the conditions inside Lucasville before that Easter Sunday in 1993, and why the pressure inside that prison had been building long before the first alarm sounded.
Conditions before the riot.
Before we get to the smoke and the fires and the takeover of L Block, we need to slow down for a minute, because riots don't just happen. They build. And in 1993, the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, usually just called Lucasville, was one of the highest security prisons in the state. It held some of Ohio's most serious offenders with violent crimes, long sentences, and life without parole. The prison itself was built for control, concrete and steel, segregation units with strict movement and tight hierarchy. But by the early 1990s, the American prison system was under heavy strain. The tough on crime era was in full swing. There's mandatory minimums, fewer releases, and across the country, prisons were filling up far beyond what they were designed to hold. Lucasville was no exception. At the time, the prison was operating at nearly double the capacity it had originally been built for. Double. Too many men, too little space, with too much tension and nowhere to go. Even staffing was stretched thin, nearly 10 positions short on the day of the riot. Former corrections officers later said the facility had been built more like a medium security prison, but it was housing some of the highest risk inmates. Now that meant constant movement inside the box, something maximum security prisons normally they try to avoid. Now, I pack that many people into a place built for fewer bodies, and the pressure starts building fast. Now, you put race on top of that. Inside Lucasville, racial divisions were deeply rooted. With the Aryan Brotherhood gangs, they held influence. The Black Muslim inmates, they had organized leadership. And groups like the Gangster Disciples had their own structure and rules. See, prison runs on power. And inside L Block, that power was always being tested. And not long before the riot, leadership inside the prison had changed. There was a new warden, Arthur Tate, later nicknamed King Arthur by some. He had taken over, and according to multiple accounts, he came in hard and too fast. Policies were immediately tightened, movement became restricted, lockdowns increased, and for many inmates, it felt like everything had changed overnight too much. And it wasn't just about rules. There were growing complaints inside the prison about inmates claimed force being used more often. Grievances were being filed about medical care. Discipline was getting much stricter, and tension, again, was building. Then something else started circulating inside the prison. See, word spread among the inmates that after Easter, the prison would be placed on lockdown once again. Now, the officials would begin going cell to cell, forcibly administering tuberculosis tests, one inmate at a time, no exceptions. That plan was later officially confirmed, folks, and the inmates, they believed it. And inside a prison already on edge, that belief alone was enough. And for the Muslim inmates, the issue was serious because they did believe the injection could contain substances forbidden by their religion, which was included alcohol or a pork-based ingredient. And they made it clear they were not going to take that shot. And at that point, the situation wasn't just about medical tests anymore. It was about control and about respect and about whether anyone inside those walls had a voice at all. And for many inmates, this became the final breaking point. Prison officials, on the other hand, well, they said they were managing a dangerous population under difficult circumstances. But when men inside a prison start believing nobody's listening, resentment doesn't just disappear. See, it hardens. And by Easter Sunday in 1993, the tension inside Lucasville wasn't just building anymore. It was right there. Mandatory testing was coming, and the inmates were refusing, and officers were enforcing. And the balance between control and resistance was about to snap.
The riot.
April 11th, inside Lucasville. The day begins like it normally does. There's controlled movement with routine procedures. Officers working their assigned post, but the tension is already there. And inside L Block, a high security housing unit, something shifts. Shortly after the uprising begins, correctional officers are overpowered, and it happens fast. Hostages are taken, the keys are seized, and the doors are swung open. Fires are set to create smoke and confusion. And within minutes, inmates control L Block. And here's the part that a lot of people don't expect. It's not chaos. It's not total chaos. Their leadership does form quickly. Men from rival racial gangs, groups that normally would not cooperate or stand beside each other, begin working together. And among the names prosecutor later identified as key figures, the leaders, there are George Skates, Sadiq Abdul Hassan, Jason Robb, Namir Abdul Mateen, and Lavelle Davis. Now, inside L Block, hostages are gathered, spokesmen are chosen, and demands are written. For the officers trapped inside, the prison they worked in every day suddenly becomes enemy territory. And outside the prison walls, the state's scrambling. The Ohio State Highway Patrol, they mobilize. Technical teams move in. Helicopters circle overhead. Media begins arriving in rural Scioto County. Smoke pours from the shattered windows. Now, inmates hang signs from the block. Sheets begin appearing in the windows. Messages written in large, visible letters. The inmates are trying to communicate with the outside world. They want the media. They want their voices heard. From inside L Block, they call out for reporters. They hang those signs asking to speak directly to the press. But for days, that access doesn't come. Officials hesitate. They control the information. They limit what gets out. And from the inmate's perspective, it feels like, well, they're being ignored. Inside the prison, that frustration, it keeps building. because this isn't about demands anymore. See, it's about being heard. Then the tone shifts. One of the sheets hanging from the window carries a direct warning, a message written in large enough letters for the officers outside to read. In 3 hours, we will kill a guard. It's not subtle. It's not vague. It's a deadline. Outside the prison, officials see the message. At least one response downplays it, calling it just another threat, something not to be taken seriously. Now, inside L Block, word of that reaction spreads quickly, and it hits hard. Because from the inmate's perspective, well, they're not just not being heard, now they're not being taken seriously. Days into the standoff, they believe they're being dismissed, even mocked. And in a situation already this volatile, that kind of disconnect is dangerous. Because now the gap between what's happening inside and how it's being handled outside, it's getting wider by the hour. And negotiators begin trying to establish contact with the inmate leaders inside L Block. The inmates, their demands include religious accommodations, improved conditions, media presence, and protection from retaliation. State negotiators now face a grim situation. They either storm the block and risk massacre, or negotiate and risk looking weak while inmates run part of the maximum security prison. And so the standoff begins. By the end of the day, the state no longer controls L Block. Hostages are still inside, and the question hanging over Lucasville is now terrifyingly simple. How does this end without a massacre?
The mud pit.
By the next morning, the state cut the power, then the water. And now, this wasn't just a standoff, it was a pressure cooker. Inside the prison yard during the uprising, there was a place inmates began calling. Inside the prison yard during the uprising, there was a place inmates began calling the mud pit. It wasn't an official location. It wasn't marked on any prison map. It was simply an area of wet ground that became something much darker. During the chaos of the riot, prisoners brought other inmates there, men who had been accused of being informants, traitors, or enemies of the uprising. They were beaten, they were tortured, and some were killed. And over the course of those 11 days, the mud pit became one of the most feared places inside the prison walls. It symbolized just how quickly order had collapsed and how brutal the internal power struggles had become among the inmates themselves. Now, for investigators who later reconstructed what happened inside L Block, the mud pit stood as one of the starkest reminders of the violence that unfolded when the prison fell out of state control.
Negotiators and hostages.
One of the inmate negotiators identified later was George Skates. Now, according to multiple accounts, Skates played a visible and important role during the negotiations. Prosecutors later described him as an Aryan Brotherhood, a leader inside L Block. At one point, he came out into the yard to speak on live radio, addressing concerns and helping communicate what inmates inside L Block were demanding. Later, guards and inmates both described Skates as someone who kept peace and protection for the inmates and guards. It's a moment that shows something important. Inside the chaos, there was structure. There were voices trying to be heard, and there were people acting as go-betweens between the inmates and the state. Inside L Block, not every inmate was acting the same. Some were pushing for control through fear. Others were focused on keeping the situation from getting worse. That was George Skates. Guards were caught in the middle of the situation they couldn't control. Their safety depended entirely on the decisions made inside that block. And every conversation, every negotiation could mean the difference between life and death.
The deaths.
By the time the uprising reaches its most violent point, the toll is growing. One correction officer will be killed. 9 inmates will die before the standoff is over. Correctional officer Robert B. Vallandigham had been taken hostage during the uprising. He didn't walk into that prison expecting to become one of the defining tragedies of the riot. He went to work and he never came home. Now, during the standoff, Vallandigham He's killed inside the L block. His death changes everything. His body is later brought into the recreation yard, a moment that shocks negotiators, officials, and the public watching from the outside of the prison walls too much. Some later accounts suggest he may have known or seen too much early in the uprising, but the exact motive for his killing is a part of the larger disputes over what really happened inside L Block. Once a correction officer has been killed, the political pressure on the state explodes. Negotiations continue, but the tone shifts. The stakes are now much higher. Then there are the inmate deaths. Several inmates inside L Block are accused of being snitches, men who might cooperate with authorities. According to testimony later given in court, internal trials were held, accusations were made, and votes are taken, and punishment followed. Some inmates are beaten, some are strangled, and some are stabbed. And this is where the story gets difficult because much of what we know about those killings come from inmate testimony that was given later during the investigations and the trials. There were no cameras inside L Block, no neutral observers. There's no clean timeline handed to the public afterwards. What we have are accounts of people who survived. Now, some of those accounts line up, others don't. Prosecutors argue that the killings were ordered by leaders trying to maintain control. The defense attorneys argue that the situation was chaotic and that the responsibility was wrongly assigned. But one fact is not disputed. Men died inside that cell block, and once blood had been spilled, especially the blood of a correctional officer, the chance of ending the riot quietly, well, that was gone, and eventually retaken.
The agreement that ended the riot.
April 21st, 1993. After 11 days of fires and violence and negotiations, the moment everyone has been waiting for finally arrives. Inside L Block, inmate leaders prepare to surrender. Outside the prison walls, law enforcement officers, negotiators, and reporters are watching closely. For days, no one has known exactly how this would end. Would the inmates keep their word, or would the prison have to be taken by force? Then the doors begin to open, and one by one, the inmates start walking out of the block. They move slowly, hands visible, following the terms of the surrender agreement. After hours of tension, the hostages begin emerging as well. Some of them have spent days unsure they would survive. They were exhausted, dehydrated, but alive. As the walkout continues, officers begin securing the block again. For the first time in 11 days, the state of Ohio regains control of the prison. And inside L Block, investigators will soon begin documenting the damage: burned cells, broken doors, makeshift weapons, and the bodies of the men who died during the uprising. The riot is over, but the questions are only beginning. Because the next phase of the Lucasville story doesn't happen inside the prison. It happens in the courtrooms across Ohio, and the decisions made there will shape the legacy of the riot for decades.
The walkout.
After the riot ends, Ohio launches one of the largest prison prosecutions in the state history. Investigators descend on Lucasville. Federal agents join the investigation, and authorities conduct hundreds of interviews with inmates, correctional staff, and negotiators involved in the 11-day siege. Statements are taken and deals are discussed. Stories are compared, clear. And pretty quickly, one major problem becomes quite clear. There's very little physical evidence tying specific people to specific murders. The block had been burned, scenes have been damaged, evidence had been contaminated. For days, chaos had ruled inside L Block. So prosecutors began building their cases largely on testimony. Testimony from inmates who had been inside the block. Some of those witnesses received plea deals. Some avoid the death penalty. Others see their sentences reduced. But the deeper investigators get into the case, the less clean the story becomes. because not every witness painted George Skates as a man driving the violence. Several later said he actually helped injured correctional officers and prisoners get medical attention during the chaos. And according to those accounts, he helped move wounded officers to places where they could be evacuated. Now, if those statements are true, they create a very different picture than one prosecutors later presented in court. But prosecutors argue themselves that certain men acted as leaders, that they ordered killings, that they maintained control through the violence, and George Skates, they claimed, was one of them. As the riot stretched on, investigators outside the prison were desperate to know what was happening inside the L block. So they did something unusual. Now, by day 3, the FBI, they were literally listening from underneath the inmates. They were in tunnels, planting microphones and recording conversations happening right above their heads. They were in a structure underneath the prison and listening to devices under the cell block. These devices recorded conversations between inmates during the uprising, and those recordings became well known as the tunnel tapes. Now, they captured real time discussions about hostages, about control, and about what was happening inside the prison. In a situation with no cameras and limited visibility, the tunnel tapes became some of the only direct evidence from inside L Block. But years later, those same tapes will become part of a controversy because questions were raised about what was really recorded, what was preserved, and what may have never been fully heard in court. Several defendants are sentenced to death, and that's where the legal battle really begins. The defense raises serious questions. They argue that the riot involved hundreds of inmates. Leadership shifted between people. It was not one clear command structure, and therefore many witnesses had powerful reasons to cooperate with the state. Now, when testimony comes from people trying to save themselves, the reliability of that testimony becomes a major issue. The trials drag on for years, convictions come down, and death sentences follow. But instead of closing the book on Lucasville, the verdicts open up a whole new fight and starts to grow.
The trials.
From the moment the trial ends, arguments begin. Critics raise a lot of issues, but one issue sits at the center of it all: the heavy reliance on inmate testimony. And that concern only grows stronger because during the riot itself, the state released very little information to the media. That information vacuum fed rumors, including inflated reports of deaths and claims of torture that were never confirmed. Now, by the time the trials began, the public had already been living with fear, anger, and confusion for years. Then came the witness problem. Many inmate witnesses received incentives to cooperate. Prosecutors say that this is common in complicated prison cases. Well, critics say it creates a dangerous setup because when someone's life is on the line, what are they willing to say? And how much pressure exists behind the scene? Now, there are also claims that certain recordings and investigative materials were never fully disclosed during the trial. Court reviews many of those claims. Some appeals are denied, others are argued for years. Race becomes part of the controversy, too. The riot itself involved unusual cooperation between rival gangs. But afterward, critics question whether prosecution decisions were shaped by politics, public pressure, and the need to show control, while the state denies those allegations. Prosecutors maintain that the evidence was strong. They say juries were properly guided. They say the verdicts were justified. And more than 33 years later, the divide still hasn't closed. To one side, the convictions brought justice. But to the other side, they buried the truth.
The controversy.
33 years today. The fires are long gone. The smoke is cleared. But the legacy of Lucasville has never really left. The prison still stands in Lucasville. It's still operational. Appeals have moved through the state and federal courts. Advocates continue questioning parts of the prosecutions. Families of the victims continue to insist justice was served. The riot also forced major changes inside Ohio's prison system. Guard stations were redesigned, movement policies were changed, and programs for inmates preparing to re-enter society were expanded. Lucasville forced Ohio to rethink how prisons handled crisis, control, and overcrowding. But the deeper questions never went away. Did overcrowding play a major role? Did leaders inside Elbrock try to limit violence or control it? Were the trials shaped by the political climate of the 1990s? Was every piece of evidence fully disclosed? The Lucasville uprising sits right where power and fear collide. Fear of inmates taking control, fear of the system failing, and fear of what it meant if the state looked weak. And even for the officers who survived, Lucasville didn't end when the prison was retaken. One of the officers held hostage during the Lucasville riot was Mike Hensley. He hadn't been on the job long when the uprising happened, still new to the role, still learning what it meant to walk those cell blocks every day. And then suddenly, he was no longer a guard. He was a hostage, trapped inside a prison that had fallen out of control, surrounded by chaos, uncertainty, and fear. And when the riot finally ended, Hensley got out alive. But walking out of that prison didn't mean it was over, because for the officers who survived, the question became, do you ever go back? And for Mike Hensley, the answer was yes. Just 120 days later, he returned to work, back inside the same prison, back inside the same environment where he had been held hostage. He said it felt like he had to go back. He had to prove something to himself, that he could still do the job, that he could walk back in there and remain professional. Before becoming a correction officer, Hensley had served 10 years in the military, and he credits that experience with helping him survive the riot and with giving him the strength to return afterward. Because surviving Lucasville was one thing, but choosing to walk back inside those walls, well, that's something else entirely. Lucasville is more than a riot. It's a story about authority, about power, and about who gets to tell the story, and about what happens when pressure builds inside of closed walls. When institutions refuse to bend, sometimes they break. And when they break, the consequences can last for generations.
Where we are now.
Now, before we close this out, there's something else you need to know. Because everything you just heard tonight, it doesn't just come from one version of the story. We have documents. We have transcripts of George Gates speaking in real time to negotiators on the outside. This isn't summaries, not someone else's interpretation, his actual words. We have tunnel tapes, the conversations that were picked up while all of this was happening, under the pressure, orders, and accusations. Moments you weren't supposed to hear. We have reports, case files, and statements, documents that were used to build these cases, and some that raise questions about how they were built. And yes, we have the aftermath, the kind of images most people never see, the reality of what 11 days inside that prison actually looked like when it was over. This isn't just one story. It's pieces, it's evidence, and it's voices. And depending on what you look at, you may walk away with a completely different understanding of what happened inside Lucasville. So here's what I want you to do. Don't just listen to me. Go look for yourself. We put everything we have inside our Facebook group, Death, Lies, and Alibis. The transcripts, the recordings, the documents, the reports, all of it. Go through it. Take your time and then come back and tell me, what do you think really happened? Because this case, it was never as simple as it was made to sound. And once you see it for yourself, you start asking different questions. And that's not all, because this story is just too big. It's too complicated to fit into one episode. So we're breaking this down even further. We have many episodes. It's focused, They're detailed and there's no fluff. We're going to talk about the 21-point agreement. We actually have a copy of the original. We're taking a closer look at George Skates, the man in the middle, and why his story still divides people today. And we're breaking down the Lucasville Five, who they are, what they were charged with, and how those cases were built. We're honoring the victims, the men who lost their lives inside the prison, and the stories that often get pushed aside. And we're digging into something that a lot of people don't talk about. That's the media blackout. What was reported and what wasn't, and how that shaped what the public believes, even today. Because if you really want to understand Lucasville, you have to look at all of it, not just what was told, but what was left out. Just getting started.
Closing.
For 11 days in April of 1993, the state of Ohio lost control of one of the most secure prisons. That fact alone is hard to ignore. A prison is supposed to represent absolute authority, concrete walls, steel doors, and armed officers. Layers of control designed to make sure something like this never happens. And yet, it did. Inside L Block, power shifts almost overnight. Men who were normally live under constant surveillance suddenly control the place. They organize and they negotiate. They make decisions about life and death. And outside the walls, the state faces a terrifying reality. If they storm the prison, hostages might die. If they wait, inmates remain in control. And for 11 days, Ohio stands at the crossroads. And when the uprising finally ends, the question everyone asks is simple: who is responsible? But maybe the deeper question is one we don't ask as often: how did it get to the point in the first place? Because riots rarely begin at a moment of violent eruption. They begin long before that, with overcrowded cells, with unresolved grievances, and with policies that leave people feeling unheard, with systems pushed beyond the limits they were built for. None of that excuses what happened inside L Block. 10 people lost their lives. One of them was Officer Robert Vallandigham, a man who went to work that Easter Sunday and he never came home. Families on every side of this story still carry the weight of those 11 days. And Lucasville forces us to confront something uncomfortable. Prisons are closed worlds. Most of what happens inside them is never seen by the public. And when the pressure builds inside a closed system, it doesn't always release quietly. Sometimes it explodes. Lucasville wasn't just a riot. It was a moment when the structure of control cracked open long enough for the entire country to see what was underneath. And more than 30 years later, people still argue about what really happened inside Outback, about who was responsible, about whether justice was served. And those debates may never fully end. But the lesson of Lucasville is hard to ignore. Because when systems ignore warning signs long enough, the consequences eventually become impossible to contain. That was Lucasville in 1993, 11 days that changed Ohio. Now, if you have information, records, or insight connected to this case, I want to hear from you. Because Lucasville didn't end when the prison gates closed. It lived on in the funerals, in the courtrooms, in the appeals, and in the memories of the hostages who survived, and in the questions Ohio still hasn't fully answered. Okay, as we wind up, folks, I want to remind you that everyone named here is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Death, lies, and alibis is for information and educational purposes only. I'm not a professional. I gather very public information and I present it to you for you to do your own research and form your own opinions. So that's it for this episode of Death, Lies, and Alibis. The story stops here for now, but the questions don't. Cold cases don't fall on their own. It takes attention, pressure, and the willingness to care when others don't. Hit the follow button on the podcast so you never miss the next episode. Join our Facebook group for documents, case files, and ways to get involved, or email me at deathliesalibis@gmail.com. And as always, be safe, stay alert, and never stop seeking justice.